Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar on the economic outlook for the state of West Virginia. We'll get started right away. We've got a quorum of people here. So here's what the outline of this webinar will look like. We're going to start by briefly talking about who REMI is and the underpinnings of our models, because we've used our models to do all of the analysis that you'll see in today's webinar. And then we'll move right into the regional growth matrix, where we've graphed all 50 states plus DC on two axes, population and employment. We'll see where they are, where they fall compared to the US average. Then we'll take a look at the short and long-term economic forecast, first for the entire nation, and then we'll zoom back in to the state of West Virginia. And we'll conclude the presentation with a brief model demonstration by my colleague May, who will show us a live demonstration of the model, and then a question and answer period at the end if anybody has any follow-up questions. So without further ado, REMI stands for Regional Economic Models Incorporated. We were founded 41 years ago on the idea that government decision makers, private industry leaders, and others should be cognizant of the economic consequences of their actions before implementing any policy or other major business change. So REMI is the nation's leader in dynamic policy modeling, and most of what we do is build the models, update them, and then get them out into the hands of our clients, as well as making sure our clients know how to use them and know how to do the theory behind economic forecasting. So you can see a not at all exhaustive list of our clients below on this slide. And now we'll move right into West Virginia. We'll get a quick snapshot, painting with the broadest brush strokes what the economy looks like, and then we'll go on to a regional growth matrix. So West Virginia has some amazingly beautiful forests. I can attest from personal experience on that, which supports the lumber industry as well as finished wood products, furniture, those types of industries, and also tourism. The reason I have been to West Virginia. The agriculture sector in West Virginia is pretty small. The soil is not very good for most agriculture, but there's some grazing of cattle and dairy cows, as well as poultry raising and some egg production as well. That sort of dominates the agriculture sector in the state. West Virginia is a big mining state, so lots of coal and petroleum deposits, as well as sand and clay and limestone, all of which are mined pretty heavily in the state. The electricity, the power that West Virginia relies on, is generated almost exclusively by burning coal. And another fun fact is, the Appalachian cultural traditions are particularly alive in the state of West Virginia. I know certainly in the realm of music and dance, and probably others as well. So we've run our REMI model for a 5-year period from 2019 to 2023 here. You can see both graphs on the right show that time period. The stats I'm about to read off are just looking at the growth over the course of last year and this year till the end of 2021. We should see a personal income growth of about 4.4%, a growth in GDP by about 4.7% in West Virginia, and a growth in output by about 4.8%. And by the end of the year, there should be 34,000 jobs that have been added back to the economy. Looking at the bottom right graph, you can see that by 2022 and 2023, employment is close to where it was at pre-COVID levels, but it does not actually get there even by the end of 2023. As we'll see in the United States, it bounces back, just bounces back by the end of 2023 using our forecast. Last thing I'll say here, and you'll hear me say it again, there is always some amount of uncertainty in economic modeling of any kind. Forecasting just generally has uncertainty around the economy, on top of some open-ended questions around how pent up the consumer demand is as we begin to crawl out of COVID, as well as the continued vaccine rollout, which is looking optimistic and I hope continues to be so. I also want to pause and say we get our data from all of REMI models from a couple different sources. the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Activity, the Congressional Budget Office, the Census Bureau, all of these sources we pull, and they're updated yearly. We update our models yearly. I also want to highlight the University of Michigan's research seminar in quantitative economics, which is also footnoted at the bottom there, because they are updating data quarterly. So we've been using, the most up-to-date information that we have access to, which, as you can see, includes the recent stimulus package, 1.9 trillion stimulus package passed, as well as, to the best of our ability, the current vaccine and consumer spending trends. So moving right into our regional growth matrix, as I hinted at before, we've got two axes here, population or demographic trends on the x-axis and economic or employment trends on the y-axis. These are some of the factors that have gone into each of those axes. As you might imagine, demographically, we're looking at the age of the population, number of people retiring, where are those retirees moving to, who else is moving into and out of the state, and then what are the quality of amenities, housing, etc. Economically and employment, we're looking at the industries in the state, how fast are they growing, how well do they pay, how productive are they, how much does it cost to do business in the state, etc. So here's what the matrix looks like before we've put all 50 states plus DC on it. So I'll walk us through it very briefly, starting with the top right and going around clockwise. So our growth economies, we're looking at states like Colorado and Texas. They're great examples of economies where both employment and population trends are relatively favorable as compared to the US national average. So these are states that are probably looking at, a relatively high cluster of industries that are, profitable, growing, as well as on the population side of things, people are moving into the state, whether that's because of those growing industries or for other reasons. People are attracted to the state and will continue to move into it in the coming years. Next, bottom right, we've got our lifestyle economies, and Utah is a great example of this. These are states where population trends remain relatively favorable. People want to move and live in that state, even though employment trends aren't as favorable as the national average, at least. So industries are not growing as fast, pay might not be quite as good, or for other factors. Things aren't looking quite as good as they are nationally, but people are still attracted to the state. Moving around, we've got our transitional economies in the bottom left. Maine and West Virginia are both great examples of this. These are states where both employment and population trends are relatively unfavorable as compared to the national average. So often these states are undergoing some sort of transition. There's a little spoiler there on where West Virginia might lie. And top left, we've got a Renaissance economy. So Massachusetts is a great example of this. These are states where population trends aren't as favorable as the national average, so people aren't moving to the state in relatively high numbers. Often these states will have an aging population that might be retiring elsewhere. However, the Renaissance economy states still have pretty favorable employment trends. So we're looking at, states where older industries maybe are being replaced by newer growth industries, or pay has remained high for many decades, those types of reasons that keep employment factors high. So let's see the graph with all 50 states plus DC. West Virginia here is starred in red. So again, we're comparing all of these states to the US average just over the course of this year and next year, 2021 and 2022. Employment-wise, West Virginia has slightly below average trends. So we'll dive a little bit into why that might be later in the presentation. Population-wise, things are looking also slightly below the national average. People will tend to be leaving West Virginia a little bit more than they're entering the state. Almost breaking even, but not quite. So that's where West Virginia is. Now we're going to zoom out and look at the entire United States, just to put things in perspective a little bit. So the same short-term outlook, this 5-year window from 2019 to 2023, but looking at the entire nation, again, you could see that blip in 2020 it's seen in economic output and in gross domestic product. It's actually not seen in our personal income line because of the stimulus checks. Personal income actually rose a little bit in 2020 and into 2021, and then as you can see, it falls slightly. The bottom right graph shows that blip much more clearly, but as I briefly mentioned earlier, by the end of 2023, the entire US is getting back to where it was at pre-COVID 2019 levels. Just over the course of 2020 and 2021, though, personal income in the entire nation should grow by about 2.9%. GDP should grow by about 4.4%. Economic output should grow by 4.4%. And there should be about 7 million jobs added to the US economy. Looking more long-term, we've run a forecast over a 40-year time period from 2021 to 2060. That's as far out as our models forecast. So we're expecting an average growth rate per year over that 4-decade span of about 1.9% in personal income nationally, 1.8% in GDP, and 1.9% in economic output per year. So we should see just over 1 million jobs being added to the US economy each year. You can see slightly more of those jobs fall in the 2020s than in the 2030s and beyond, where the growth rate becomes a little bit more steady. Okay, zooming right back in to the wonderful state that you all came for. Let's look at employment and then population in the short and long term, but a little bit more stratified to get a little bit better picture of what types of shifts the West Virginian economy is undergoing. So just in these top 5 fastest growing industries, we should expect to see about 12,000 jobs increasing by the end of 2021. And as you can see in the chart at right, healthcare and social assistance takes up almost a quarter of those fastest growing industries. Wholesale trade is a little bit as well. And then we've got a couple all other categories. The green all other includes private industries, religious organizations, grant-making organizations, other civic organizations, any sort of personal or laundry services, etc. And here are industries with the highest annual compensation rates, which, manufacturing's at the top, followed by mining and wholesale trade. You can see the blip in 2020 for each of these. It takes some of them slightly longer than others to get back to where they were in terms of employment at pre-COVID levels, but they all do get back where they were. Okay, population-wise, here's a snapshot of the population pyramid in 2021 at the end of this year. It's a pretty constrictive pyramid, meaning that there are more folks who are older than there are younger folks. Birth rates are relatively low. As we saw in the last graph, healthcare and social assistance is already a fast growing industry in the state of West Virginia. And if we look in the long term, as we're about to, you'll see that that'll become even more the case. Slightly more of a detailed look at population here. We'll read this graph starting at the left and going to the right. So our starting population is about 1.8 million in the state of West Virginia, or it was at the beginning of 2020. Deaths, you can see, outweigh births. More people are dying in the state than are being born. Slightly more, just slightly more retirees in West Virginia are moving to other states than retirees from other states are moving into West Virginia. However, economic and international migrants, we're seeing people move into the state. Economic migrants meaning people who are moving from other states in the US to West Virginia for other economic reasons, for any, economic activity that's happening in the state. International migrants, as you might guess, are people coming from other countries. Special populations looks like fully zero. So the ending population is slightly, ever so slightly lower, actually, by the end of this year than it was at the beginning of 2020. That will not be true quite in the long term. So here it is. We've looked again over that same 4-decade window. We expect to see an average growth rate per year of 1.6% in personal income, 1.5% in GDP, 1.7% in economic output per year, and about 2,000 jobs added to the state of West Virginia each year. And the employment forecast here looks actually very interesting. It kind of jumps and skips around a little bit. Let's take a look a little bit why that might be. So, wow, healthcare and social assistance takes up over half of the growth in the state of West Virginia. As the population gets older and older, professional, scientific, and technical services is a much, much bigger chunk. And we've got that all other category being much smaller. So we should see by the end of 2016, over this 4-decade period, just under 80,000 jobs increasing in West Virginia, just in these top 5 fastest growing industries. So you can see this blip here, again in 2020. Manufacturing does take actually a more prolonged dip into the 2030s. Begins to level off then later in this window that we've been looking at, whereas wholesale trade is slowly declining in the amount of jobs in the state over the course of the next 4 decades. Let's look at population. Here's an interactive graph of how the population is moving through over the years. I'll let it run once more, starting again in 2021. So if the population pyramid looked constrictive in 2021, it's only looking more constrictive now. Birth rates remain, actually just shrink, birth rates get quite lower. So here again, a snapshot in 2060, even more of a constrictive pyramid. As we saw, healthcare is a much greater percentage of the fastest growing industries in 4 decades. This is true most places in the US, but it's particularly exaggerated in the state of West Virginia here. Here we'll go, we'll look a little bit more in depth. Again, reading from left to right. So deaths outweigh births by a significant margin, even to the point of outweighing the number of people moving into West Virginia from other states. Again, it's because of a constrictive population pyramid where many more people are dying than are being born. So actually, the ending population of West Virginia is, even in a 40-year time period, slightly lower than it was at the beginning of 2020. Population overall should remain relatively stagnant over the next 40 years, according to our model. So we'll actually show you the model now live. I'll hand things over to my colleague May, who will take us through what a possible scenario might look like if we wanted to demonstrate it.
Thank you, Julian. So in the model demonstration part, we're going to run the scenario of an optimistic outlook. We have seen the national baseline quantity of the RSQ ECBO as well as BEA, where the total employment slowly comes back accompanied by a steady growth. But as Julian mentioned, there will be a lot of uncertainty, include large consumer demand, supports of vaccine, as well as stimulus checks. Though it's very difficult to quantify all these impacts, we would like to try a little experiment inspired by Janet Yellen, who predicted that the economy could be back to full employment by the end of this year. We wanted to test what growth we will have to see in the economy to make that happen. And after testing, we imported a macroeconomic update increasing the GDP growth rate by 2%. Now we can look at the employment changes both on the national level and the state level. So on the next slide, on the left, there is total employment in the US, and on the right in West Virginia, with the blue lines representing the baseline forecast and the orange lines representing the forecast where growth in every component of GDP has been increased by 2%. That is to say, if consumption grew by 0.5% from year to year, now it grows at 2.5%. With that, the US gets back to normal by this year and begins to exceed its previous employment in 2022 and 2023. And West Virginia is having a very similar recovery trend. But please bear in mind that a 2% increase in the components of GDP is very optimistic. Certainly if the vaccine rollout continues smoothly or even ahead of schedule, or consumer confidence really picks up, we might see something approaching this. Now we're going to show off the model and explore more about the job increase from the baseline to the optimistic outlook. So the model we're using is the 51 region model with the 50 states and DC area. We're looking at REMI model PI+. Its home screen's purpose is to provide quick and simple access points for starting the use of the model and to simulate policy changes. So just by clicking on the proper tile, you can start creating any one of the 4 types of forecast available in PI+. There are regional simulations, national simulations, regional controls, and national controls. Also, if you're interested in exploring REMI's default control forecasts that form the basis, you can dig directly into the data by clicking on either regional forecast or national forecast. Let's do regional forecast as an example. So it will show only the results section. We can see that specific tables, maps, and data visualizations have been specially chosen to display REMI's baseline forecasts and also provide informative profiles of the national and regional economies. So for the short-term and long-term forecast, we used national control to import the March update. For now, we're going to still use this tile, but in the macroeconomic values, instead of the baseline forecast, we use the optimistic outlook. Now we have it as a macroeconomic change in the input list. The next step is just to run the forecast. To save some time, let's jump directly into the results section. Here, if we change the region into West Virginia, and we're looking at years from 2021 to 2030. Here, the category is GDP, which means the 2 lines are representing the baseline and the optimistic outlook. And obviously, the lower one is for the baseline. The upper one is for the new update. We just imported these differences. So as a result, in the total employment, we can also notice a large difference between these 2 outlooks. Again, the upper line is representing the simulation for optimistic outlook. The gaps between these lines are even increasing over years, but this is only for the total employment. If we want to explore more about the detailed employment information, we can continue with the employment by industry. Here, the model is separating the total employment into different industry sectors. We're using the 21 industry sectors level, so we don't have too many lines here in just one chart. The comparison type is now levels, which means these lines are representing the actual number of jobs. Since we're more interested in the differences, we change the comparison type into differences. So now we have on the top, we have the industries that are contributing the most job increase from the baseline to the new update. The top industries are healthcare and social assistance, state and local government, and retail trade. Besides differences, another very interesting comparison type is percentage change. So some industries are contributing a lot of job increase because they have a large base, but by looking at percentage change, we can know which industries are growing the fastest. Let's zoom in again. So the top industries are federal civilian, retail trade, forestry, fishing, and hunting, and a lot of other industries that are growing very fast as well. So hopefully these functions can give you a better understanding of what is happening behind the increase in total employment. Now I'm gonna give it back to Julian for the conclusion.
Thank you, May. That was lovely to see. So what have we learned in the last half hour or so? Well, first, we risk sounding like a broken record, but it needs to be said yet again. Economic forecasting is pretty hard to do. Some things just can't be predicted, like a worldwide pandemic. Also, whenever a new president is elected, there are some pretty substantial changes to the federal government. There are also state and local governmental shifts that we're seeing. All of that on top of the general uncertainty around the economy that always exists. However, REMI's models can help. They go a long way in economic forecasting, and our models are particularly special because of a couple reasons. First, they're dynamic, which means two things. One, that we can forecast out to 2060 is forward thinking, as well as what happens in 2021 affects what happens in 2022 and 2023. They build on each other like that. So because of that, REMI models are able to ask the conditional questions. We can say what happens if we do X, Y, or Z, as you saw a little bit in May's demonstration today. So we often talk about the 3 C's of economic modeling, or the 3 reasons why people might use our models. And the first is to clarify a complex policy problem, break it into its parts, highlight the connections between them, make it easier to understand. The second is to calculate, if you need the hard quantitative data for a grant application or an impact report or other sorts of, something that needs that math behind it. And the third is to communicate better to the public, to policymakers, what have you, to better tell the narrative and bring the economic impact argument to your policy discussion. So thank you so much for coming. We appreciate you all attending this webinar for West Virginia.